A famous painting is what you're looking at here from the French Revolution. And this is another, like in the previous lecture segment, we saw the anonymous painting of the storming of the Bastille. This is a painting of the tennis court oath, which was an incredibly pivotal moment in the French Revolution, when the members of the Third Estate, which really was the body that represented the bulk of the population of France, had effectively boycotted the French Parliament, the Estates General. They had left the Estates General and they went to an indoor tennis court where they made preliminary agreements about a parliamentary monarchy, about a more republican government, about a government in which there was a monarch, but the monarch was limited in power. And this became known as the Tennis Court Oath at an indoor tennis court in 1789, which really marks the outset of the French Revolution. The causes of the French Revolution, the long-term causes. First of all, long-term causes inherently is the decline of the French aristocracy and also of the monarchy. There's a declining power in the sort of old medieval era nobility and aristocracy. And instead, there's a rise in a new class of people, the bourgeois or the bourgeoisie. In a way, what you could think about the bourgeoisie, this is like the upper middle class. This is a new sort of strata in the demographics of French society that is growing as a result of changes in economics, changes in technology, changes in society. These were trained lawyers, businessmen, and they were making wealth through their craft in this new age of technology and society, new age of economics. But yet this segment of society is actually really not allowed to be equal participants in the French state, because the French state was organized, hierarchical. It was hierarchical on class lines. The aristocracy and the church made up the top two estates, and you're either part of the church or you're born into the French nobility, the aristocracy. Everyone else in the third estate are individuals who are either not part of the church or they are not born into those first two estates. The period of time in which the French Revolution will occur, the period of time in the 1600s and the 1700s, the time of Louis XIV, Louis XV, Cardinal Richelieu, this period of time in France is known as the Baroque Age. And it's an age of really extravagance, where the wealthiest people sort of lived to the most ostentatious level you could imagine across France. And in a way, this is a product also of the 30 Years' War and the creation of independent states that have a greater sort of right to be free from the outside intervention of others. The end of the 30 Years' War results in a greater level of stability across Europe. And that war, the 30 Years' War, which was a long-term culmination of the Protestant Reformation, results as a result of that balance of power in the geopolitical map of Europe, results in countries being allowed to sort of deal with their own issues. It results in the creation of stronger independent states, some of which, like the Dutch Republic, are republics, and they are more open to free thought and expression, and they're more embracing of the new sort of economics of the day. Other places like France, you have the creation of an absolutist monarchy, and an absolutist monarchy that also really encourages the aristocracy to live at and beyond their means. The Baroque Age is an age of extravagance. Opera houses are built all across France. Elaborate art galleries and the requisition of incredible building projects are all associated with this period of time. The wealthiest people in society lived beyond their means and grew a great deal of debt. And that also was the case for France as a whole. France as a whole during this period of time was a society in which the wealthiest people generally lived very extravagantly and ran up large debts. And the same story would be said of the country itself, a country where you had a great deal of personal debt held by people and you had a great deal of national debt. All in line with this during the Baroque Age, you witness as a result of this a real widening of the gap, the wealth gap, the determinants of wealth and social status. The people with money are seemingly doing better and better and flaunting their wealth more and more, while people in lower social standing, peasant classes, artisan classes, are facing greater hardship, economic hardship. They're not doing as well. There were also famines during this period, and a very significant famine in the 1780s, which was in a lot of senses one of the critical developments for the French Revolution. So there are some long-term tensions here. We have kind of the aristocracy, and we also have a decline in the quality of the French monarch. Louis XV and Louis XVI, neither of them sort of held up to the model of Louis XIV. And so you have a decline in the monarchy, a decline in the aristocracy. Meanwhile, you have a changing economic reality with a large new class of individuals that are outside of the aristocracy, outside of the clergy and the Catholic Church, but are becoming increasingly significant from an economic standpoint. You also have a society that is largely an indebted society, where wealthy people live beyond their means. They build up massive debts. They owe their allegiance through their debt to the aristocracy, the monarchy particularly, in Versailles, and in which the masses of people are seemingly worse and worse off as a result. The government, in short, was not representative of the people as the nature of French society changed. And as French society changes more and more significantly, the lack of representation of the people as crisis unfolds in France becomes more and more significant. The short-term crises, and the painting you see here is a painting of the French Estates General. The Estates General was the French Parliament. And it actually, when the French Revolution starts to unfold, it had not been called into session since 1614. It was really a not truly representative body. It had its origins in the medieval period, and like the British Parliament, it was primarily in existence to raise taxes in times of war, but it did not represent the masses of people, and instead it really just provided a body for the various estates, the first estate and the second estate and the third estate, to deliberate on national policy. But it wasn't democratic, and we'll talk more about that in subsequent lectures. The short-term crisis is leading to the French Revolution was growing national debt. France, as I mentioned in the Baroque period, indebtedness amongst the wealthy was a commonplace phenomenon, as it was an incredibly ostentatious period with incredible building projects, incredible extravagant lifestyle on the part of the wealthier people in society. And that translated also over to the French country as a whole, the French monarchy as a whole. There was a real debt crisis in France. There was growing national debt. And this had a lot to do with the fact that France had been involved in a number of costly imperial wars. The first of which was the 7 Years' War. And if you're an American history class, it would be called sometimes the French and Indian War. And this was a war that was fought in colonial North America. It was also fought on the high seas, and it was also fought in Europe. It was a conflict for Americans, of course. In American history, it's a conflict about Americans and the British fighting against the French and their Native American allies, and ultimately succeeding in pushing France out of the continent of North America. In short, it delivered France their most stunning colonial defeat in history. And that, of course, was delivered famously in the Plains of Abraham in Quebec, when General John Wolfe defeated General Montcalm, in what is today Canada, in Quebec, and the French, of course, are pushed out of North America. Well, that conflict is incredibly costly for the French. They lost all of their North American possessions as a result of that conflict. A decade later, a little bit more than a decade, about 15 years later, the French, of course, create the famous Franco-American Treaty. They become aligned with the American revolutionaries in the American Revolution, largely not because there was any will on the part of the absolutist French monarchy to side with Enlightenment-driven revolutionary thinkers in America, but because they saw the American Revolution as a chance to effectively fight the British, to hurt the expanded power of the British Empire. And so we see the French side with the Americans, and during that period, the absolutist monarchy of the French very much sought to weaken the American revolutionaries. Ultimately, they wanted to maintain, if Americans succeeded, they wanted the United States to remain a small and relatively insignificant entity. They sided with the American revolutions largely to fight the British. And in that case, they succeeded. Problem was, as all wars are, the Revolution was a very expensive war. It created a lot of debt for the British, actually, as did the 7 Years' War. But for the French, their economic system was a little bit less, because of the nature of the lifestyle and the thinking when it came to taxes and the economy in France during the Baroque period. The French ran up very large debts that left the country unable to deal with those debts. And so in France, the short-term crisis is a growing national debt because of the involvement in those wars, a very weak leadership on the part of Louis XVI, who will really fail to compel the wealthiest people in the country to raise taxes or to pay taxes at all. And then coupled with this, the lack of a meaningfully active parliamentary body, the Estates General. In addition to that, you have, connected to that debt, you have a massive economic crisis that unfolds in the 1780s. And this was because of uncontrolled debt. It was because of an inability to tax the wealthiest classes of people. The church, the nobility, paid effectively no taxes in France. The taxes have overburdened the Third Estate, the bulk of French society. And so you have uncontrolled debt. In the 1780s, late 1780s, there's a massive famine too. That makes the hardship on the part of the peasant class in French society that much more difficult. And by 1789, France is going bankrupt. And it is really these factors that really lead to the critical mass of events